All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Star Wars Mark of Balance. My name is Mark, and today we're going to be celebrating the 2-year anniversary of the Star Wars Mark of Balance podcast. It's crazy. I've had the podcast so long that I now can't remember what life was like before the podcast, and that's really great to say that it's now become so ingrained to my day-to-day that it's just normal, and I really love that. And of course, I want to thank you guys for the constant support throughout. This is about a month overdue for this episode. My original air date for my first podcast episode was on January 3rd in 2021, and my first post on Instagram on the Mark of Balance page was on January 6th of 2021. So yes, I do have an alibi. I was not at the Capitol on January 6th all those years ago, but don't worry. I wish the boys luck on their raid of the Capitol. So I know they thought I was there in spirit. So that's the important part. Kidding, of course. But the reason I'm finally getting my butt in gear and recording this episode is because we have another important anniversary in Star Wars podcasting coming up. Star Wars Podcast Day is coming up on February 7th, and that commemorates the first Star Wars podcast ever. It was called Jedi Talk. It was released on February 7th, 1999, which is really crazy for a podcast to imagine in the 90s someone had a podcast. I don't know who was listening. I don't know how they were getting out there, but big respect to Jedi Talk. This is the 24th anniversary. And shout out to Daniel, who runs the official Star Wars Podcast Day page. He organizes the entire event. He reaches out to all these podcasts to see if they're interested. And then he highlights the podcast, tells all of his followers where to get their podcast, where their pages are on Instagram, Twitter, any social media. And it's just amazing that someone goes out of their way to highlight what we do. So really appreciate you, Daniel. Appreciate the idea and the event of Star Wars Podcast Day. And I'm happy that I'm going to be doing my 2-year anniversary episode in honor of this 24th anniversary of Star Wars Podcast. So thank you again. Wanted to give some backstory on that. And now getting into the episode, the reason this is probably a month late is really because I was juggling how exactly I wanted to go about doing my 2-year anniversary episode. If you guys recall, or if you're new here, my 1-year anniversary episode, I'm still really proud of. It was probably one of my favorite episodes to record. I basically got 8 or 9 of my close friends and my sister Jen, who's on the podcast all the time, to come together in person, and they basically interviewed me. And they asked, about the podcast and about Star Wars in general, my takes on Star Wars. Obviously, you guys hear enough of that, but sometimes there are things I don't really talk about because in my interviews, I like to highlight the interviewee. I like to hear about their Star Wars story and kind of insert my thoughts here and there. And then, of course, on my analysis video, I'm very focused on that particular piece of Star Wars content. I'm not really talking about my broader thoughts on Star Wars, favorite characters, favorite side characters, stuff like that. So I was thinking for a 2-year anniversary, how can I top that? Which, I really can't because it was such a special episode to me. But I was going back and forth, and then I thought, this year for me was a year of change. It was a tough year personally, and then I think that kind of reflected in the podcast. The podcast was a bit more inconsistent this year with releases. I know over the summer I took a pretty long break. I was not releasing weekly at all. So I thought it would be important to just highlight that and talk about this year and the tough parts of this year and how I've grown as a podcaster. I definitely won't get into the personal stuff because, that's not the point of this podcast. But, how I've changed as a podcaster, how I've improved because of it. And hopefully you guys can take something away from it because this year I did learn so much about myself and creativity and how to kind of improve yourself through change. So I definitely want to kind of pass that on to you guys in any way, or if you were just kind of curious why the podcast was a little bit more inconsistent, maybe this will shed some light on that as well. So definitely a very different flavor of podcast for today, but it definitely will still be Star Wars focused. And I think it's actually fitting that I do something really different out of the box because the first thing I want to talk about is how experimental and how diverse my podcast content was this year. As you guys know, I rewrote an entire Obi-Wan Kenobi series script with my sister. I've never written a script for anything, and it was probably the biggest creative endeavor I've ever done other than this podcast. But writing that script was such a huge feat. I don't think I'll ever do it again for a podcast episode because it was so intensive, and I know my sister wouldn't be able to do that as often as she could because she's the screenwriting expert. She's a screenwriter, so she helped a lot. My script would have been nothing without her help. But That and also the script read through of Duel of the Fates, which was the original script for Rise of Skywalker. I did that with Jen as well. And both of those two things were something that were really out of the box for me because in one aspect, it was very creative in writing the script for Obi-Wan, but also performing the script. It's very vulnerable when you have to perform these emotional moments in a script, and especially in a script that maybe you've written, like reading your own words. It is a crazy kind of thing, and it changes your perspective on not just how you view the arts, but the respect you have for performers, like how they open themselves up and they just have no shame. They just put it all out there. And when you do that, when you get rid of your shame, when you have nothing holding you back, it really does come across. And I'm not saying I ever reached that threshold where it was perfect and I was performing at a high level, but it did open a different part of me. And I feel like now, having gone through those two experiences and making those two episodes, I do feel like I'm better at not only appreciating the arts or performances, but also in general, just putting myself out there, being vulnerable. I really think that has kind of rubbed off on me. And of course, when you're writing a script, I mean, you're really putting yourself out there. I know there were some moments when I was recording or writing with Jen and I was like putting these kind of emotional pieces into the script. And I'm like, oh, this is kind of soft. This is kind of, and I was just like, no, that's me. That needs to be in the script. That is something I feel passionate about. I think the characters would act that way. And it was just a different part of my brain. And I encourage anyone listening, whether you're the most creative person or you're the most, closeted creative person where you don't express yourself, it's definitely worth it to do something in that vein because it does really expand your horizons. So that's really what I took from those two podcast experiences. Those were really incredible, really labor intensive, very tiring, let me tell you, going for 2 hours, reading an entire script and also adding emotion to it. I mean, it really takes a lot out of you. I have no idea how voice actors do it in the booth all day. It's incredible. The lung capacity, the endurance of being able to talk for so long. I know sometimes when I record podcasts or Star Wars Story interviews, over an hour, I get off and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm dead. I have no idea how Joe Rogan or any of those people do like the 3-hour podcast. It's crazy. So really, I gained a lot of respect for creatives. I gained a lot of respect for performers and in general, just putting yourself out there. I think that is huge and I cannot recommend it enough. So whether that's going to a lip sync bar and just singing your heart out up there, or I don't know, I really don't know how you would go about any of this, but just giving you that firsthand experience that it is definitely worth your time. So that was one of my big takeaways from this past year. Another big thing from my personal life in this past year has been a lot of change. A lot of the change has been good. I don't want to say it's all doom and gloom, but there was other parts of it that the change was a bit more difficult to go through. And for the podcast, change meant, as I already said, try new things, but trying new things in the content I made. I think the Instagram Reels this year and putting in that extra effort to highlight pieces of my episode that I'm really proud of really went a long way to expanding my audience and maybe expanding my podcast to even my own followers on Instagram, because maybe they just see the post and they support the post, they support the page, but maybe they don't really dive into the podcast themselves because I don't give them enough content to really dive into, because frankly, getting into a podcast is very, very difficult. It is a lot of effort to listen to a 40-minute episode of something you're not used to, and you don't see my face. So there's that lack of connection there. So really changing the way I approach marketing. And I'm not saying I never knew I had to do it, but really taking that step to say, no, I'm super proud of this. I have to get this out there. I have to expose more people to the podcast. And it was great. The results were fantastic. The Andor reels I did while the show was airing did incredible. The one I did for Andy Serkis's character got over 18,000 views, 17,000 views, something like that. I didn't just lie, I promise. And almost 1,000 likes. It was crazy. And then a couple of the other ones around Mon Mothma or the initial trailer to Andor, they all did really well. And I was so happy that they were being seen by people. Even if it didn't exactly correlate to new podcast listeners, it got more followers to the page, and hopefully that will lead to more listeners in the future. And the format, the way I came about that format of putting the scenes together was just something I did just from trying, just trying new things and changing the way you try to make content really goes a long way. I mean, I didn't look up that formula anywhere. I just said, how can I portray what I'm talking about, but also make it visually appealing? And, I was like, if I'm talking about the scene, my sister brought up like, hey, all of that scene is going to be on the same color palette. So if you do it, it's going to first be visually appealing when someone looks at it, like, oh, everything's very uniform. And then on top of that, I'm able to screenshot where I think the most interesting shots are. So adding that creative lens to it as well. And again, opening that part of myself that I kind of had when I play video games. When I play video games, like the photo mode is my favorite side activity to do. I would just constantly go into new areas and say, oh my gosh, this is incredible. I want to take different angles, different photos. How can I use the depth of field? How can I use the focal lens? How can I use the filters? How can I capture these really unique pictures inside the game? Because games look incredible nowadays. And that was a creative part of myself that I kind of, kept to myself. Like I took these photos for me. I was like, wow, these are really amazing. I really like this. I really like what I did here. And of course, that was a process I went through as well in taking those photos in game. Like my first couple were very bland. They were just like wide shots, like, oh, this is cool. This is cool. This is nice. But the landscape was doing all the work for me. As I went on, I was like, how can I add my own personal flair to this? How can I make this more interesting? And I think that creative eye I had in video games then translated to these reels where I was able to say which shot in these scenes is the most important to portray what is going on, what are the most interesting shots, what are the most visually striking shots, and how can I layer them? I think it comes out to be about 5 screenshots for those reels. How can I layer them to kind of tell the story? Of course, they're sequential in chronological order, but also, that opening landscape shot, what does that tell about the scene? And then the facial expressions on the characters, what do they say about the scene? How does that portray that visual storytelling to someone that may not even listen to the reel, but they just see it and they're like, okay, so what's going on in that scene? And then they click into it. And then in the end, I usually pick a wide shot that kind of wraps up the scene well. But I also hope to add a little flair to that as well. I think with my Commander Cody and Crosshair one, the last shot I put in was something of a wide shot kind of showing either Cody walking away or kind of the grand militaristic view of that courtyard in the clone base on Coruscant. What does that say about the military state that the Empire is in right there? All of these things kind of went together, and that all came about because I opened up that creative side of me, and I was able to bring something I was passionate about before into this with the photo mode in games and brought it into this aspect. And that never would have happened if I didn't change how I made content, change how I portrayed my podcast to people that don't follow me. And as I said, maybe people that do follow me, but don't engage the content as much. So that was one thing I changed this year. And the other thing I want to talk about my content is the book reviews. I mean, those have been definitely my favorite pieces of content to make for Instagram specifically. And I think they're my best looking content as of today when it comes to Instagram posts. And you can go back to my first ones. Trust me, they are very rough when I compare them to today. But I actually like keeping them on the page instead of redoing them because I really like going back to see like where it started and then saying, okay, how did I improve on the next one? Then the next one, then the next one. And while I did look for inspiration across other Instagram pages that do book reviews or just online in general, everything you see was just me trying new things about how I can make it more interesting, how I can cut out the noise in the post, how I can fit more words into the summary without overbloating it, but not giving too few words where it's just basically the back of the book summary that you would pick up in the bookstore. Like, how can I insert my views into this while also keeping it very broad so it's not spoilerish? And I obviously took graphic design tips from things I was seeing online, like, oh, that's interesting how they're layering that. That's interesting how they use boxing here, how they use transparency here. I've taken all those things into consideration, but I really only learned how to make those posts where they are today with my most recent one on convergence, which I'm super proud of. It's definitely my favorite one from a visual standpoint between the colors, the background transparency, and having the book cover kind of faded in the back. That was all just from trying new things and changing how I approach those book posts. I could have probably stopped after maybe Light of the Jedi or Rising Storm. Like, those were probably the most generic I could have gotten to, and I could have just stuck with those. But I was always like, how can I make this better? How can I change this to make it more appealing that someone scrolling through the explore page could see that and be like, oh, okay, yeah, I want to look into that. Oh, this is a cool summary. Oh, he puts his favorite quotes in here. Oh, cool, cool. Let me check out his page. Oh, it's a podcast page. Okay, let me see some of these reels that he's now doing. And just kind of having that sequential order of things that they can just discover the page and then want to see more about it. And the favorite quotes thing, I'm kicking myself every day because as I go back in my post, I'm like, why didn't I just expand the entire secondary artwork to the entire background instead of just having it right above the words favorite quotes? That's the one thing I wish I could change, because those secondary art pieces look so much better when I expand them. And again, I'm glad I finally, changed it. I'm glad I finally tried a new formula, but that's the one thing I wish I could change about the post. But I really love how that looks now with the artwork behind the favorite quotes and drawing from that colored palette to make it a really interesting post. So this is all to say, trying new things, testing new things may be frustrating, but the reward of just kind of picking away at something and then eventually you find it and you're like, oh, okay, no, this is getting better actually. And then you just keep going and going and going, and it becomes something you never thought it might have been able to if you just kind of sat with it. And I know when I watch, those artist videos or those people or those painters, those videos where they're, adding all these little details or they're taking away these little things, you're like, does that really make a difference? And you realize they're just trying stuff. And when they try stuff, they discover new things and they just keep going and going. And then by the end, you're like, okay, wow, that was all incredible decisions just based on trying things. So I know the motto for the podcast is do or do not, there is no try, but you should try things. And I could even argue that I wasn't trying things. I was just doing things and then they ended up working. So boom, I didn't contradict my philosophy at all. Or you could go by Andor's philosophy and Nemec's philosophy is just try, a different look at it. Just try and eventually you'll get there. So that's my other big takeaway from this year. That hopefully helps you out in your regular life, creative endeavors, whatever. And the last thing I want to talk about is something you've probably always heard, and that's putting yourself in uncomfortable situations or being backed into a corner or being under pressure makes you perform better. And that was definitely true this year because I actually learned how to edit audio much more efficiently and to make my audio sound a lot better. So I actually learned the software I'm using and tried to improve that aspect of the show, because before I realized I was doing it very, very tediously. I used to actually go through my podcast when I was editing them and I would physically cut out the moments of silence, or I would cut out the little pieces of noise in the background. And I realized that could have just been done with a function in Audacity. It's crazy. Audio software that's there to help you edit audio better actually makes the job easier. It's crazy. It's mind-blowing for me. But to be honest, I probably would have never pushed myself to do that and learn about, I can actually just cut out all the silence at once. I can actually get rid of all the noise and distraction in the background at once. I wouldn't have done that if I wasn't under these time crunches throughout the year because, life was happening and a lot was changing around me and I was still trying to put out episodes, but I had way less time and brain power to do so. So I had to adapt. I had to learn how to do it faster. And now that, the tougher parts of this year have gone away, like that skill that I learned during that time is now like amazing now because I have time and I'm just able to edit these episodes so much faster. And the quality of them, I think, is much better by the end of the year. Definitely. I know, halfway through the year is probably still learning it, but I think by the end, it's my best sounding episodes. So this one was a much shorter anecdote, but, in total, those uncomfortable positions, being under pressure, it may be uncomfortable. It may suck at the moment, but you actually learn a lot faster. It's a lot of fight or flight, survival of the fittest, adaptation, all those nature terms. And it ended up helping me a lot. And now I can edit this episode that I'm talking about right now, probably in a fourth of the time that I used to edit it. So a lot less stress and I think a better product in the end. So definitely put yourself in those positions. So that about wraps up all of the things I learned this past year from the podcast, from personal life, and how that's translated into the content I make. I hope you get something out of this. I know there was not a lot of Star Wars talk here. I am going to now start talking about Star Wars, but I did want the first part of this episode to talk about those lessons learned and just be kind of upfront and vulnerable with you guys, which I learned throughout this year. And now I'm applying it, and I hope you could feel that authenticity in the episodes that I've released before and in this episode now. And yeah, I'm really happy with how this 2-year anniversary came about. It's much different. It's much more diverse, but I think that's a theme that my episodes have kind of had this year. And speaking of my episodes and my content I've released this year, I want to focus this next part of my episode on my favorite pieces of content that I've released to you guys this year. I'm super proud of the catalog. It's super diverse. It's much different than my first year, and I'm really proud of that. And I'm glad that I was able to expand, even though the algorithm probably hates it. The algorithm's like, hey, do a specific piece of content. Your listeners want one specific piece of content. That's how you reach the most people, but I don't really care. I want to make content that I want to make. So I thought it would be fun to just highlight what I was most proud of in this past year. There have been some previews of what I'm probably going to say earlier in this episode, so you probably know some of the things I'll highlight, but I thought it would be fun to just talk about it, maybe how it came about, and yeah, just highlight it again. So if you're feeling nostalgic and want to go back and listen, or if you joined later in the year and you want to hear about content that I released before, maybe this will give you that kind of window into those different pieces and you can go back and engage with those. So yes, now we will get into the fun Star Wars content. And it actually works out perfectly that I released my podcast in the beginning of January so that the Star Wars year coincides with my podcast year. So all of the Star Wars content that I've made content for in this past year will be covered in this list, which I think is cool as well. Did not plan that, but it just worked out that way. So I already talked about my Obi-Wan series rewrite with Jen, my sister. That was an incredible feat. I am so proud of that. I am definitely going to work on reels for that so that more people can be exposed to it. It was so much fun. It was so much work. Obviously, so many writing calls, so many different days of recording. But in the end, I am really proud of the product we put together. I think every character is enhanced by the way we dealt with it. We increased Reva's mystery around her character. We gave her more room to breathe, and you knew kind of her backstory earlier on, and you got those hints, and I think that makes you connect and empathize with her much earlier on than in the show. The Grand Inquisitor is a much bigger part of our series. He is Reva's antagonistic force throughout. He's jealous of her. He is scared that she's going to take his spot. They both were at the Jedi Temple when Order 66 came down. They connect on that. It's such a more interesting story than her just stabbing him in the beginning and then him coming back later and be like, hello. So really proud of that. I think Obi-Wan and Leia were good in the show, but we didn't want them to have too close of a relationship. So we separated them a bit more than in the show where they were very, very close. And I think this kind of matches up better with the timeline in A New Hope. So really proud of that. But we still had those moments where they did connect. So we were proud of that being able to stick to the Obi-Wan script that we saw on screen, but also adding our own flavor to it. And finally, the final battle between Obi-Wan and Vader happening on a battleground from the Clone Wars, I think, is so much more interesting than this open black sand area that they fought on in the show. We thought it brought kind of that symbolism, that visual storytelling that, hey, this is the past that they're still reeling over. These remnants of the old war are still fighting. They're still affecting our characters today. So we really wanted to bring that aspect into it. So the setting was a huge thing that we brought into this, and the locations where these battles fought were also reflective of the story. Obviously, Reva trying to escape the Star Destroyer at the end was another thing that we wanted to have because she's physically escaping the Empire, escaping the Star Destroyer. And as I said, fighting on an old Clone Wars battleground is perfect symbolism for Obi-Wan and Anakin, two relics of the Clone Wars, fighting again. The other piece of content I really loved was the Duel of the Fates script read-through, which I mentioned before. It's not a perfect script. It's not a perfect story. I'm not saying it fixes Episode 9. There was a lot of intrigue. There was a lot of deep cuts to canon Star Wars lore. We had Mortis. We had kind of that Force drain ability that Kylo learns. And I think the final battle happening on Coruscant was so incredible because Coruscant was a constant. It was how the Republic grew, and then, of course, how it fell. And having that final battle with Finn, Rose, Poe, Chewbacca, BB-8, C-3PO, R2-D2, all being on Coruscant in that final battle against Hux and the First Order. It was very full circle. And then really enjoyed the Rey and Kylo stuff. It was very violent. It was very visceral, but I think in the end it made a lot more sense than maybe what we got in the movie. And yeah, overall, very proud of that, because I know reading an entire script is maybe not something you guys would do on your own. So us reading it, me and my sister, and adding our own, beautiful performances to it might have made it a lot more accessible to people. So I'm really proud of it for that reason. Okay, so these next couple are outside of stuff I've already talked about, so I'm excited to kind of dive into these. But my best rant episode this year definitely came for my episode 6 Book of Boba Fett review. I still love listening back to it because I just go on an entire rant because of the meeting of Ahsoka and Luke happening in the Book of Boba Fett, which just makes no sense. Context matters, and to this day, I could still rant about it, but I absolutely love that episode. It's so fun. It's so passionate, but it's not annoying. It's not like to the point where I'm like a hater or anything. It's just like very fun to listen to, because it was just boiling up from the fact that the last episode was all Mandalorian, which was fine. That's fine. It was a great episode, but the Book of Boba Fett story was just out of the picture. And then the next episode, they go even deeper into the Mandalorian plot. Grogu getting involved, Luke and Ahsoka having this conversation. And then, of course, the finale, which, I talk about in the episode after that, Grogu and Mandu getting together. It's just absolutely crazy. I did it again. I called Mando Mandu because I say Grogu. I don't know why I do that, but it happens. But yeah, that's an epic rant episode. If you haven't listened to it, or you just saw Book of Boba Fett and you're kind of working back through my catalog, please go listen to that episode. I think it's so fun. The next episode was one that was near and dear to my heart. It was something I always wanted to do, and I got to give a shout out to Kyle Henderson, who appeared in the episode, for really, kicking me into gear and saying, if you're going to make a Star Wars score episode, you have to involve me. And I was like, you know what, Kyle, I was always going to involve you, but now we're doing it this weekend. And so we set it up for that weekend, and it was so much fun. We talked about every type of Star Wars score, from the prequels to the originals to some of the sequels, and really we kind of had this natural discovery of certain things that John Williams did just by talking about the score. Something that we talked about was, the droid march eventually became the clone Jedi Temple march. That same beat and cadence from the droid march in episode 1 and 2 was then reused in episode 3 for the clones. And it was just kind of that realization that, like, the droids and the clones were one and the same. The clones became droids essentially because of Order 66 and the chips in their head. They had to follow orders just like droids. They had no autonomy. So that was just like one cool connection we had. And then something else we realized was that, the best part of the Return of the Jedi score, when Luke's going crazy on Darth Vader, that piece of music isn't in the official release of Return of the Jedi score by John Williams. It's just not in there. We tried to find it, but we couldn't find it. And only Samuel Kim, our favorite, YouTube composer, he made a whole track about that. So we discovered that as well. So that it was just a really fun episode. It was something I'm super passionate about. Kyle's very passionate about it. And it would have been hard for me to maybe do on my own without just doing a top 10 tracks from Star Wars. So I was really appreciative for him coming on the episode. And I think it came out great. So anyone that maybe wasn't into score, listened to that one, said, oh, yeah, no, I appreciate this a little more. And again, if you're new and backtracking through my catalog, I highly, highly recommend that episode. The next episode, super, super proud of this, just from a logistics standpoint, was the Obi-Wan series roundtable, where I got 9 or 10 listeners and friends to come on and give their opinions on the Obi-Wan Kenobi series as a whole. It was a great feat, if I do say so myself, but it was really enjoyable because of all the people that came on and were so open to working around my schedule. And I think it just came out really great. I love how everything just transitioned very nicely. I loved the diversity of opinions. It wasn't all good. It wasn't all bad. It was some in the middle. Some loved it. Some hated it. And in the end, it was just like a great community episode, which is something that, I think the year 1 anniversary did, but that was, kind of just my closer friends. And this expanded it to the entire community of people that listen or interact with the Instagram page. So I really was just proud of that. And I think it's a great listen if you wanted to go back and check that out. So some honorable mentions of some of my favorites from the past year. My top 5 video games episode, I really enjoyed that because it was half a top 5, and also it it was able to give me a review opportunity for all those games that I wasn't able to talk about because I didn't have the podcast at the time. But I was really able to dive into my Jedi Fallen Order thoughts, my things that I loved about it, things that I didn't like about it. I was able to talk about Republic Commando. I was able to talk about Force Unleashed. I was able to talk about all of these games that I've played throughout the years, that I've loved, that I've cherished for so long, and I was able to put those in the forefront and able to like dive in and say like, this was really good, this was really bad. From a gameplay perspective, this was good, this was bad. And those games, I wouldn't have been able to really do reviews for those by themselves. I mean, I could have, but they would be like, 10, 15 minutes. I don't think it really would have been worth it. But when I came up with that idea for that episode, I was like, oh, this is, a great opportunity to really do deep dives for each of these. So I was really happy that came together, and my video game content for Star Wars always strikes a nerve with people. People love and connect with Star Wars video games, so I do really enjoy making that content because it's not only for me, it's for you guys as well, because you guys really, really enjoy it. So that's another episode I highly recommend. I did listen back, and I'm not crazy with the editing I did on some of the voicing. There's some like awkward cuts, and there's some awkward like breathing cuts as well. So I'm not crazy about the editing. I wish, maybe that would have been a little bit better. But as I said, I'm still learning. I'm still getting better. But yeah, definitely a good listen. I highly recommend that one as well. From a post perspective, I really enjoyed my Music Mondays this year. I think my Music Mondays has skyrocketed in quality. I know when I started out, I didn't even have like snippets. And then I finally started incorporating snippets, but I kind of put them off to the side because I was like, oh, I need to write more about the track in the actual snippet. But I'm like, no, just let the track speak for itself. Whether that's a good decision or not for engagement, I don't know. But I think they're much more clean now. And I enjoy that I continue to expand the horizons of the Music Mondays, where I'm talking about movie scores, I'm talking about the anime scores, I'm talking about video game scores, I'm talking about Star Wars scores that maybe people can't listen to, like Rebel Season 4, like where to find that, because that's either on YouTube or on the Kiner Brothers website. And I really love Music Mondays. I know you guys are probably like, why are there so many anime scores? I think in general, anime really invests a lot into their scores, but also animation in general, I think gives you a lot more freedom with scores because your budget is a lot higher for scores because you don't have to do named actors, or you don't need all of these people on sets. You need all the animators, but I think the budget allows for a lot more room for scores. I also think that you need that more human connection with the score in animation because it isn't a real human that you're looking at. So you need that music to kind of bridge that gap as well. So that's kind of the reason I post those a lot, because I think they are some of the best out there. And I like to bring light to things that maybe people don't appreciate or they don't have exposure to. So that's a little, behind the scenes why I do a lot of anime scores for my music days. They're just fantastic. And then finally, I already talked about this, but my book post, loved my book post this year. I think they're, really reaching their top potential. Even though these books haven't been my favorite in the Star Wars catalog, they have been my favorite posts that I've made. So proud of those, and definitely expect some more book content in podcast form. I'm definitely putting together an episode on, why I think Star Wars canon books have become the most consistent form of storytelling in Star Wars. But stay tuned for that. So finally, my favorite content I've released this year is easily, definitely, without a doubt, Andor. And I couldn't say just one episode because I loved my analysis for all the episodes. There are definitely some episodes that stand out to me. I loved my One Way Out review where I dove into Mon Mothma again, and that decision she had to make to sentence her daughter to an arranged marriage, and that realization on her voice, and that whole journey throughout this whole season of her realizing that she has to sacrifice her morals for the cause, and also that, having the freedom to choose, which she's never had before because her life has been very dictated by other people. Having that freedom to choose has consequences. So I'm really, really proud of that analysis of Mon Mothma. And I also had another great analysis in The Announcement, episode 7, I believe, where I talk about the smile scene where she takes her friend through the party, and the scene just is so excellently structured and accelerates and accelerates and accelerates. The music builds. It's fantastic. It's one of my reels, so definitely go check those out. The other episode I'm really proud of was the Andor trailer episode. Like, I went back and listened to that episode, and it was really fun to go back to. It was a moment when I watched that trailer. I was like, wait, no, Andor actually might be the best Star Wars show they've had just based on this trailer. It looks a lot different than maybe what I expected at that point with Star Wars shows. I was like, damn, okay, this might be different. And a lot of the predictions I made in that actually came to fruition. I mean, not in the exact ways, but they definitely followed the pattern of something that they set out in the trailer. And I had that little rant that, Andor's village was destroyed because of the mining operation, and that mining stuff was probably used to build the Death Star. It ended up that Andor worked on parts that worked on the Death Star that eventually killed him, but he was destroying the symbol of that empire that destroyed his life when he was younger. So I was in the ballpark, so I was kind of in the area. So that was a really fun episode, and I'm really proud of that reel. I think that was the first reel I did in that format. So that's another big reason I love that episode as well. And then finally, the Nobody's Listening review, where I did the now famous in the Star Wars Mark of Balance lore reel of Andy Serkis and Kino Loy's character about his institutionalization. That reel has done so well, and that was like the first time I saw my reel like doing really well. I got that dopamine hit of riding the algorithm and getting like 100 likes in one night. I'm like, whoa, what the hell? So that was, a big moment for the podcast this year. So definitely super proud of that analysis and that whole entire episode of Nobody's Listening. But in the end, Andor gave me so much great content to talk about and really dive into that analysis portion of this podcast that I really loved, and I was having a tough time doing based on some of the lackluster shows that we got this year before Andor. So was happy to get back into that. And that kind of wraps up my list on all the content that I'm super proud of this year. Very diverse, very different for me, and it allowed me to open myself up more, as I talked about in the beginning. So again, all of these lessons learned are not possible without your guys' support of either just following the page and liking posts, DMing me about things you liked about Star Wars, about you watching Star Wars the first time, or about just like a meme that you really like about Star Wars. All of that means so much. And of course, listening to the episodes and, agreeing, disagreeing, anything, just interacting with me about the content that I put out, it means so much. And I wouldn't be able to learn these things about myself if you guys didn't do that, because then I probably would have just, given up on the podcast at this point, which again, I had that thought this year as I did in my first year. I was like, these numbers aren't doing well. Is this all really worth my time? I went through that again this year. But by the end of the year, I definitely was reinvigorated. And now I'm really excited for 2023. Huge year for Star Wars. Hopefully all the content hits the right notes, and I can learn even more lessons, and I can apply all these lessons that I've learned even more for even more exciting content, even better content for you guys. So it's just a nice positive feedback loop, and the cycle continues. So again, thank you guys so much for the constant support. Please let everyone you know that enjoys Star Wars about the podcast. Let them know where to find me on Instagram, or just give them the episode links that maybe they'd be interested in. They don't have to listen to every episode. There's so much different content that they can interact with. They can pick and choose what they really like. I like that my content is that diverse, that someone that might not like Bad Batch doesn't have to listen to all my Bad Batch stuff. They can just go into the Andor stuff, or they can just go into my Clone Wars stuff, whatever they want. But word of mouth is the best way to market and grow the podcast. So would really appreciate if you continue to give me that support. That would be great. So as always, follow me on Instagram at @star_wars_Mark of Balance. And as always, for the second year in a row, stay safe, stay healthy, and may the Force be with you. Peace.